Good evening. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows are attending your meeting, and I welcome them in your name. Minutes.
Society of Antiquaries of London, Ordinary Meeting, Thursday, 4th of March 2021. This meeting took place online only. Mr. Paul Drury, President in the Chair. The minutes of the previous Ordinary Meeting of Thursday, 25th of February 2021 were read and will be signed at Burlington House. The certificates of the following candidates for election were laid before the Society and ordered to be suspended in the usual manner. Tessa Wilde, Rob Wiseman, Christopher Claxton Stevens. The Treasurer reported back from the Finance Committee, which had met earlier that day. The committee had approved the Q3 management accounts and the 2021-22 budget and recommended both to Council for approval. They had received a report on the investment portfolio, and finally they had received an update on the Burlington House PR campaign and the financial implications of either staying or being forced to move. The following communication was then laid before the Society. The first stones, Penawylod and Gwern Vale in their early Neolithic context, by William Britnell, FSA, and Professor Alistair Whittle, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication before the President closed the meeting.
Thank you. I will sign these minutes as a true and complete record when I'm next in Burlington House. Meanwhile, if anyone has any corrections to the minutes, please email the General Secretary. Certificates.
Thank you. There are 10 certificates this evening. And I'll just remind fellows, I am reading the shortened version, but do look on the website if you want to read the full version. Tim Allen, MA, HND, a development advice archaeologist with Historic England, who is interested in the multi-period landscapes and towns of the English Midlands. Sir John Baker, LLB, MA, PhD, LLD, Emeritus Professor of Laws of England, University of Cambridge, who has written extensively on English legal history, including the history of legal costume, sergeant's rings, and medieval lawyers' funerary monuments. Louise Barker, BA, Senior Investigator in Archaeology for the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, a landscape archaeologist and a leading expert in the discipline of analytical survey. Eleanor Barraclough, BA, MA, PhD, Associate Professor of Medieval History and Literature at the University of Durham, specializing in the medieval Nordic world. Barbara Burley, BA, MA, an experienced small find specialist and curator at the Vindelander Trust with experience in formal and informal learning, outreach and engagement programs. Timothy Bolton, BA, MA, PhD, Head of Department for Western Manuscripts, Bloomsbury Auctions, with particular expertise in Anglo-Scandinavian interaction in the later Viking period and on into the Middle Ages. Chris Bryant, MA, Member of Parliament with a long-standing interest in historical and antiquarian scholarship and the author of 7 books on modern English history. Steen Clemenson, MSc DPhil, who has published extensively on heraldry and genealogy and has been a board member, secretary and auditor of the Scandinavian Heraldry Society. Hilary Cousins, BA, MPhil, PhD, lecturer in Roman history, Lancaster University, specializing in Roman provincial archaeology and the religion, art and epigraphy of Britain, Gaul and Germany. Gareth Davies, BA, MA, PhD, an experienced field archaeologist who has published on the development of early medieval Repton and Nottingham. Thank you.
Thank you. Council met earlier today and formally adopted the budget for the coming year and had wide-ranging discussions on progress in the last year and prospects for the coming year, particularly around our future at Burlington House, which we're attempting to secure, as I'm sure many of you will know. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper Anglo-Saxon Hydraulic Engineering in the Fens by Professor Michael Chisholm, FSA. Michael Chisholm is an economic geographer. He was a member of the Local Government Boundary Commission for England in the 1970s and the Local Government Commission for England in the 1990s. His first job was in agricultural economics at Oxford University, leading in 1962 to his first book, Rural Settlement and Land Use. Initially, Michael's interest in the Fens was roused while chairman of the Conservators of the River Cam, a navigation authority established by Parliament in 1702. Curiosity, which drives him, then led to the examination of the medieval network of navigable waterways, resulting in several publications from 2003 onwards. As a retired professor of geography at Cambridge University, he has had the time and the privilege of access to major library resources, enabling him to undertake the present project, which is nearing completion. I'll say at this point, there will of course be a Q&A session at the end, and if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it into the chat function on Zoom, and I will ask the questions at the end of the lecture. It's helpful if you hold your questions until towards the end of the lecture, so that I'm not swamped with questions that have been answered in the course of the lecture. So, Michael, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm hoping that my first image will come up, please.
Can you see that?
I can see that, thank you, yes. And the reason for showing this is not that I want to spend much time specifically on this slide, but I want to draw attention to the difference between the silt fens in the north and the peat fens in the south. They have substantially different histories and background relevant for the Anglo-Saxons, but they do share one thing in common, namely that for the last 2 centuries plus, there has been the view that only the Romans or the Normans would be capable of doing anything major in the way of hydraulic engineering. And that is symbolized, roughly speaking, the coastline you can see in this diagram. There is a well-known, long-recognized sea bank, which has the appellation Roman Bank. And that was given 2.5 centuries ago on the basis that only the Romans could have done it, no evidence that Normans had had a hand in it. In the context of the silt fens, from the recent times, the realization has grown that that sea bank is not of Roman origin, but is of Anglo-Saxon origin. And with that, the realization that quite a lot was done by the Anglo-Saxons in the silt fens. The contrast is that in the peat fens further south, the predominant view for a long time has been that very little, if anything, was done by the Anglo-Saxons to alter the waterway system. And in a nutshell, that is not the case. Clifford Darby, writing in 1940, and then again in 1983, in relation to the peat fens, no major works identified. A wilderness is the presentation. And that comes forward even to the year 2017 with a more recent book, Water and Environment in Anglo-Saxon England, edited by Hire and Hook. The discourse has been changing, and I want to sketch very briefly what that discourse change has been about. But I'm going to jump first from this, if you like, blank canvas to a map which I would like to have. The second image, please. I asked the question of myself, how much did the Anglo-Saxons actually do in the Fens? And this map is based upon literature and the work of others. It's not my work, it's my distillation of their work. And you will see that there are blue channels, which are the ones that I regard as natural. You will see that there are brown channels, which are ones which I regard on the evidence available as being canalized natural watercourses. And then the red ones are wholly new artificial channels. And you will be wondering how on earth one could get to that kind of presentation from the view of only a few decades ago that very little was done by the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the basis for the discourse has been changing because of changes in archaeology in particular. As most of you listening to this will be well aware, the volume of archaeological work since the Second World War has become much, much greater than it ever was before. And in addition, important new tools for archaeologists to use, carbon-14 dating being one such, but giving the capacity, of course, for absolute dates rather than just relative dates. A companion science, the Quaternary studies over the last 2.5 million years of Earth's history, have been yielding new developments as well. Pollen analysis is one of them, enabling much better understanding of environment and environmental conditions than was ever possible before the war. And those two things combined have generated a lot of new information that was not available in the past. And then the third thing that has happened is that starting in 1987, under the leadership of David Hall, there was the Fenland Survey. That was an extraordinary piece of work involving a lot of field walking over a large part of the Fens, picking up bits of pottery, other evidence of human activity, and identifying the periods of time to which they belonged, and then relating all of that information to other published work and to the documentary evidence. And the result was a succession of volumes over the Fens between 1987 and 1994. And the individual volumes provide a trove of new information and new interpretation. So a great deal has happened in that quarter, and this is fundamental really to our understanding or possible understanding of what was actually going on. Now, I'd like to note at this point, if we could look to the left top of the image, you can see Peterborough and tracing along Catswater, Old Southey and Shire Drain, all the way to Tid St Mary. We have a water channel, apparently a continuous one, but all of it, in the current estimation, artificial in some degree, either canalized natural or totally new. And if we could have the next slide, please. I'm going to go back now into a little bit of history. This image is taken from a book, The Black Fens, that was published in 1958 by a guy called Astbury. And at top left of the diagram, you will see he boldly says original Neen, all the way from Peterborough to the sea. That original Neen is those three channels which now are to be regarded as artificial. Astbury was no fool. He had very good authority for the idea that that was a natural watercourse. the Geological Survey of the country, set up in the 19th century, a volume in 1877 by a well-known eminent geologist, Skirchley. He accepted that channel as being a natural channel all the way. And that view, in relation to Cat's Water specifically, that view was expressed as late as 1989, not that long ago, in another geological memoir as being a natural course as a distributary of the River Nene. So there's a well-implanted view that that was a natural river, and I regret to have to own up to the fact that I did subscribe to that view. You'll be asking then for the evidence as to why I say those three channels are artificial. And I'm going to begin with Cat's Water, the first one. If we could have the next image, please. This is the surface geology published by the Geological Survey as a 1 in 50,000. And you will see Cat's Water, the black line running from south to north up to a place called Nene Terrace. And then you just see a little bit of Old Southie going off at the image at the top. That is Cat's Water. If we come to the south end, you will see Flag Fen. That's it. The Flag Fen Museum is beside the site of Flag Fen Bronze Age settlement that was discovered in 1982, and the full reports published almost 2 decades later, 2001, by Francis Pryor. The significance of Flag Fen is the following. The archaeologists dug some trenches and they went down to the base gravels locally there, gravels that would have been deposited during the waning phase of the last glacial period. The last glacial period came to an end about 10,000 years ago, and the energetic rivers before then depositing a lot of gravel. On that gravel, the archaeologists found a soil had developed, and the sections rising nearer to the surface show no evidence whatsoever of the deposits a natural river would give, the silt and sediment that would be deposited. Categorically, one can say that Cat's Water was never a natural distributary of the River Nene. And yet we know that in the post-conquest years, it was a navigation channel. The documentary evidence is categorical that it was used for that purpose. So we have an interesting little problem that the archaeological evidence that I've just mentioned shows this must be artificial. The archaeologists, in terms of the Bronze Age period, interpreted Cat's Water as a local little stream of no great significance, but adjacent to the Flag Fen site. Well, going further north along Cat's Water, you can see it runs along a ridge of what you won't be able to read, I think, very easily. These are gravels. This is a gravel ridge, and you'll see that it not only goes up onto this, but it goes over to the other side at Nene Terrace. So that's, as it were, a second affirmation that this is an artificial channel. Nature, it would not do that. And the third bit is that on the archaeological investigations along Cat's Water, the evidence has been found in field marks of a channel, the whole imprint with embankments either side, 46 feet wide, 4-6 feet wide, in the section 1 mile long that has been identified. Now, the thing that I have not mentioned so far is that one of the reasons why Asprey and others accepted the whole channel, Cat's Water the lot, as being a natural river is the following fact. It is the county boundary for Cambridgeshire from Peterborough to the sea. And as many of you will well know, county boundaries came into existence and on the whole were set in, not in stone, but were established by about the year 1000, give or take. And I'm following the eminent scholar Fenton in making that assertion. There are very minor deviations between these 3 channels, Cat's Water included, and the county boundary, such that one has to take the view that the artificial channel of Cat's Water existed by about the year 1000. If we could now go back, please, to the second illustration, the map of the waterways. Thank you. And I've mentioned Old Southey before, from Neen Terrace to Clough's Cross. It's shown as a wholly artificial channel, and the basis for making that assessment, which is based upon archaeological work, is that it cuts right across the evidence of former watercourses that run, roughly speaking, at right angles across that course. And you'll notice also some rather sharp, not quite rectangular bends, which are not those of a natural watercourse. We can say, I think, with real confidence that even if Cat's Water wasn't natural, that also Old Southey could not itself be natural from other sources. It, again, in the post-conquest period, was a navigable waterway, and at the documentations from commissions of sewers later on, we're talking about a 40-foot channel. So that's sizable watercourse. If we go to Shire Drain, it looks in many ways natural, but there are 2 things that a natural river would have had. It would have had an estuary, and there is no hint at all with Shire Drain that there ever was an opening, widening into the wash in the way that it does for Wisbeach, for example. And secondly, the geologists and archaeologists have not found evidence of what is called a rodon, R-O-D-D-O-N, rodon, which is the silt sediment that a watercourse lays down in its bed and its adjacent banks. These 2 facts tell one that Shire Drain has to be an artificial creation. And there is confirmation here. The first bit of documentary evidence, and but not quite the only one that I can produce in relation to the Anglo-Saxons in the Fens, is that there is a document, a rather important document in this context, called the Liber Elyensis, that may be familiar to some at least, compiled by a monk at Ely, and the last date in the compilation is 1169, so it is thought that the document was completed, so far as it was completed, by about 1170, give or take. And it recounts the early history of the monastery after it had been refounded about the year 970. And that account of the early years includes a specific and direct reference to the digging of a great ditch to mark the boundary of the land held by the abbey at Ely after its refoundation. And given that it's in the context of the first abbot that this was done, it has to be the late 10th century that Shire Drain was created. As a boundary marker, yes, but it is on a scale not as big as Old Southie, but on a scale to suggest that it was intended also to drain a certain amount of water from the fens further south. Although Catswater, Old Southie are known to have been important navigations, Shire Drain has no record that I have found to suggest that it ever was a significant navigable waterway. Might have been used locally for a bit, but not otherwise. And it remains something of a mystery. There are two other channels that it is important to consider in context of these three. And if we go back to Neen Terrace, you will see Crowland Cut from Neen Terrace to Crowland. The Crowland Cut is the name that I use for this channel. It rises over a low ridge of gravel, the gravel on which Crowland itself stands, and that itself reveals it as being artificial. There was St. Guthlac, whose name as a saint is closely attached to Crowland, 699 to 714, and there is the view that the abbey was founded, as it were, in his memory after his death. The evidence that I have seen indicates that at the most there would have been a small hermitage of acolytes. Certainly no evidence that I know of that there was ever a monastery until the 10th century. Guthlac and his contemporaries would not have had any cause to dig an artificial channel. And it is quite clear to me that this artificial channel from Crowland to Neen Terrace must have been dug by the abbey. And there would be good reason for them wanting to do that, because at that time, Wisbech was the main port for the Fens. Spalding was an alternative, smaller one, but Wisbech really was the one. And the reason, and we can work it out from this map, is that Wisbech was the outlet for not just the River Neen, but also for the River Ouse. All of that water is in one way or another converging on Wisbech. Another reason why the abbey would have wanted this link is that it had three manors down in the Cambridgeshire area in the far southeast. And the only way efficiently to have the communication would have been to create that channel. And that links then to the final channel in this context. At Clough's Cross, going south, you can see Fen Dyke. That cuts across the natural drainage of that area, and it brought a navigable channel. It was known to be a navigable channel. It brought a navigable channel all the way to Guyherne. Guyherne itself sits where there was a small stream called Wisbeck Stream, natural, but it would have had to have been canalized to enable proper access into Wisbech. So the suggestion I make is the following: that these 5 channels together look suspiciously like some form of project. The abbey at Crowland would not have wanted to dig Crowland Cut to Neen Terrace if it didn't go anywhere. Catswater, if it were dug to open up access from the River Neen, if the water didn't go anywhere after it got to Neen Terrace, it would have had some utility, but not much, and it would have been increasing the drainage problems of part of the Fens very seriously. And Fen Dyke, there would have been no point in digging that if it didn't serve a purpose. And an important purpose, again, this dike had a recorded post-conquest width of 40 feet, was a substantial navigable waterway. Now, the idea that you could have, I'm going to use this term in inverted commas, a project of this kind of scale amounting to some 30 miles of waterway in the Fens in the Anglo-Saxon time may sound outrageous. The problem I have is, or any problem rather, if you feel it's outrageous, is how do we square that with the fact that three of them, the Catswater, Old Southey, Shire Drain, clearly have to have been in existence by about the year 1000, and they are clearly artificial. So at this point, I want to turn to the question of who might have dug these channels before we go on to consider other channels around in the Fens. And basically, this brings one to the abbeys. And it's fair to say that the abbeys have been given a very low profile in the literature about the Fens and about the early part of that time. And the relevant facts are as follows: that around about the year 970, 5 Benedictine abbeys were established in the Fens, either established or re-established, but it's the re-establishment meaning that they were established as Benedictine. And these are Crowland on the one hand, Ely, Peterborough, Ramsey, and Thorney. And I emphasize Benedictine. Some of you will be well aware that the reform that King Edgar introduced when he became king, England at peace for the first time in a united kingdom, he set about state building in a very serious manner. And on the literature that I've read, one can make a number of statements to support that. One, the uniform currency that he introduced, numerous towns with their mints, but a uniform currency, dispersed delivery thereof. And the Benedictine reform needs to be thought of as a part of the state building, as I see it. In the context of the Fens, a very important fact is that there was high level of patronage. Benedictine abbeys answered to the king. Nunneries answered to the queen. Edgar had 3 main advisors, Ethelwald, Dunstan, and Oswald. Ethelwald was a very rich man in his own right, and so were the others in lesser degree. And Ethelwald had a very close hand with 3 of the abbeys in the Fens, with Ely, Peterborough, and Thorney. Oswald had a very close hand in relation to Ramsey and an indirect one in relation to Crowland. In other words, the Fenland abbeys that were established had very high level of patronage and power and authority in the context of England at that time. And the further point is that these abbeys were extraordinarily wealthy. Now, Domesday records are open to quite a lot of doubt in all sorts of ways, and different scholars have come up with some different opinions. But broadly speaking, the abbeys as a whole across the country in England at the time of Domesday were owned between 1/6 and 1/4 of the land value of England. The Benedictine abbeys, on the whole, were good deal wealthier than the average. One author talking about several dozen smaller abbeys, the same worth as one of the Benedictines. And at the time of Domesday, Ely was the second wealthiest abbey in the country after Glastonbury. Of the 13 richest abbeys in England, 3 were in the Fens. Ely on the one hand, Peterborough and Ramsey. The other thing that happened is that from about 970, the endowments that Ethelwold in particular organized for Ely in particular, but there were similar things going on for the others. The effect of this was the accumulation of landed estates in the Fens, such that by the end of the first decade, by around about 980, the abbeys owned virtually the whole of the peat Fens. Ely being the preeminent one of those abbeys. Now, this is all, of course, in relative terms, but in the context, one has to say that the Fens had an extraordinary concentration of wealth and power at that time. And the other facet of the context is the following, that by the time Edgar came to the throne, England had gotten a long way towards a commercial economy, reflected in the coinage that I've mentioned, but the evidence of trade and all the rest of it across the North Sea and to the continental countries going south and north. And that commercial economy was the context in which the abbeys operated. And so, although in the literature, it's common to think of one of the reasons for having abbeys in the Fens was that these were remote, appropriate for religious observance and for contemplation, that overlooks the fact that they were running businesses that by the context of the time were large and dispersed. That's evident in the book that John Blair recently published in 2018, if I remember, Building Anglo-Saxon England. The commercial context, these abbeys, is clear-cut. And there is some good evidence that is rather extraordinary in terms of fragmentary manuscripts that have been put together that Rory Naismith has written about, called the Ely Memoranda. A single parchment of text divided into 5 different pieces, if I remember rightly, bound into separate volumes, residing in separate libraries. In the 19th century, early 20th century, it was recognized that they actually belonged together. And he has relatively recently published a major paper on the material in those documents, which are basically accounts of one sort or another. They are for the Abbey of Ely, and they record items purchased or given to Thorney. They were making quite a lot of gifts or loads to Thorney. All of these are valued, whether it's the figure for a fishing boat, a value for a slave, or a number of pigs, as the case may be. That document covers a period early in the 11th century, about 1006 to 1030, if I remember rightly. So this is a reflection of the context in which the abbeys are operating and how they're operating. And one or two examples just illustrate my point. From its abbeys, from its manors within the peat fens and the fens generally, the one abbey of Ely had each year what is called a render, in other words, gifts, donation, you could call it a tax, of eels. And that render was 100,000 eels per annum. It's difficult to visualize that the monastery consumed all of those eels. One has to assume that they were being sold on into urban markets, probably London and elsewhere, on a considerable scale. Another item worth mentioning, it's in the memoranda, is that Ely gave to Thorney some pigs. And some of those pigs came from sources further south from the fens, distant up to 70 miles. The basic point that I want to make is the following, that the abbeys were managing their estates at a detailed level of management. For this purpose, they needed to have communication between their properties and the abbey. And that would be for people to move, or people to go and make sure that things are being done properly as it should be, to move products, livestock. And the concept that I want to put to you is that in order for the abbeys to run their commercial enterprises, they had to be able to communicate. And in order to communicate, there was a need for modifying the waterway system away from that which nature had provided to one more convenient for their purpose. With that thought in mind, it's worth looking at one or two other channels in the figure that you have in front of you that I will draw your attention to. First, more or less in the middle of the image, you will see March. And you will see that to the west of March, there's a blue natural channel going to Elm and out to Wisbeach. But you will see the red going through March to the village of Upwell to the northeast. March stands on one of the so-called islands in the peat fens, and the channel is dug quite deeply down through some chalk that outcrops there. It is an artificial channel, and the assessment by archaeologists is that this is an Anglo-Saxon construction. The effect would be, if you wanted to come from the south to join up with the River Ouse to get to the rivers and context there, instead of having to go all the way up to Elm and then back up through Outwell to get to Upwell and then on to Old Croft, it would be a shortcut. And I think we have to think of this as decidedly a modification for transport purposes. And one of the reasons for saying that is that it's actually a longer way round for the water of the River Nene to get to the sea. And being a longer way round is not, sorry for the noise there, is not one that would have happened naturally. The second one I want to draw your attention to is Knutsdyke. This is near Whittlesea Mere in the left of the diagram. There we are, that's Knutsdyke. Well, King Canute comes, of course, in the 11th century. The current view is that this was dug when Ramsay began to build Stone Church after its foundation in around about 970. The other church abbeys, they all built new churches in stone after their foundation stroke refoundation at the end of the 10th century. Knutsdyke would have shortened the journey for stone that might be coming from down the Nene from Pillsgate and Barnack further to the north and west. It would also have avoided the problem of Whittlesea Mere. The problem of a mere is that you can get rough water, and heavily laden barges, if they ship water, are in real trouble. The other thing that the meres do is to suppress the impact of the tidal regime. All of these rivers in the natural context were tidal as far as Cambridge in the south, as far as Peterborough, right far inland. And those meres would have reduced the amplitude and reduced the impact of the tidal regime. And Knutsdyke would have had some impact in shortening the journey for water and therefore the drainage of the southern part of the Fens. So we need to think of channels as being multi-purpose. And the final one on this diagram that I want to mention is down in the southeast, 5 lodes that you can see, A, B, C, D, E, and it's actually 6, isn't it? No, 5, that's right. They used to be thought to be Roman on the basis that one of the lodes, there was Roman artifacts in the bank. But it turns out that that lode actually runs through a Roman settlement and therefore has to be post-Roman, and the material Roman in the bank would have been secondary deposition and not dating that channel. These channels interfere completely with the natural drainage of that area, which naturally would concentrate on the little hamlet of Upware that you can see by the letter A. Well, time is running on, and I want to draw attention to one final issue. If we could have the 5th slide, please. Thank you. You will not be able to read this diagram, and I don't expect you readily to do so. It is taken from the work of Hallam in the 1954-65 period about the part of the silt fens north of Southey. At the bottom of the diagram, we can see Southey through Throck'nholt. And what Hallam did in his study was to worry about the banks running from east to west. You can see a series of banks running either east-west or then turning northwest to southeast at the eastern end. Series of their banks. And in Hallam's estimation, this was the process of progressive colonization of the fens working southwards. The villages, you can see the black dots with names on the peat silt fens, and they were taking in land south and south. And the concept is that in order to convert fen grazing and fen regime to arable, it was necessary to protect that land from the waters, flood waters from the south from the peat fens. His scholarship, I think, is extraordinary, and I have no quarrel at all with his identification of banks and his dating of them, successively newer going southwards. The problem I have is that I don't think that these were banks built to keep out floods, because there was already a bank along Southie, or Old Southie, as I have been calling it. And the idea that I wish to put forward is that these east-west banks were not banks to keep water out, but the result of digging ditches wide enough to be fences to keep livestock on the fens south, those livestock out of the arable land, and that the banks therefore are a byproduct of a different process, digging ditches. I think at that point, that requires a significant reassessment of the relationship between the peat fens and the silt fens. And that, I think, is a big program for some future study. If I can now go back to slide 2, which is the network. Thank you. We'll leave that on for the moment. In summary terms, I think the evidence is clear-cut. Give or take, this map that you're seeing now represents the waterway network that was created by the Anglo-Saxons. We know that a good chunk of it must have been done by about the year 1000, and I think the probability is that most of the rest was done then. I can be fairly clear that the River Lark, which is at the eastern side of the diagram, and the village of Isleham, that the River Lark was diverted in the early 11th century, at the time that Bury St Edmunds was founded in 1020. So that's a bit later, and it is probable that the Cam loads that I mentioned may have been earlier, and certainly some of the other loads at the edge, I think, will have been earlier than 970, but by how much, we don't know. In a sense, whatever adjustments might be made, I think we now have to rethink a number of things. One, the role of abbeys, the Benedictine abbeys in the fens. Two, the history of the fens themselves. It has been posited that nothing very much was done with the peat fens until the 17th century, when Vermeulen undertook his drainage scheme from 1649, and there had been some attempts before then. But the feature here is that the Anglo-Saxons did quite a lot, which survived for the best part of 600 years. And I think that that is really the point at which I would stop and welcome questions, comments.
Thank you very much. Now, could someone turn my video back on, please? Thank you. Right. Now, beginning to get some questions about this extraordinary set of engineering works. This, from Michael Gilbert, this would have been a labor-intensive project. Do you have any indication of how many laborers would have been required? And where did they come from? How long did it take?
Short answer is no idea. the comment I would make is that when Vermuyden was doing his work in the 17th century, there was something like 10,000 prisoners of war, Scots and Dutchmen, that were put to work doing that. Mm. But we do not know how many other people there may have been. But that gives you some idea that you're looking at a sizable workforce. I believe that labour would have to be drafted in one form or another from outside the Fens to have made it possible.
Yes, yes. I mean, of course, it all depends on the time period over which these works were spread. 150 years, I think, at least, in your estimation. Oh. So presumably it's an incremental process?
No, I'm sorry. Can I beg to differ? I think most of the work happened between about 970 and the year 1000.
Right, sorry. So
which is a very short
years.
Yeah, about now, give or take, but we have no documentary information that I know of. But the parallel with the 17th century, the parallel with that is that it was external funding that was required to undertake his scheme, and these abbeys had command of remarkable resources.
Yes, quite. Now, Daniel Parr asks, when did the Great Ouse start to flow towards Lynn rather than Wisbeach? Was that a man-made change in course?
The evidence that I have suggests 12th century. My interpretation is that the Wisbeach outfall with the Ouse and the Nene coming in was the point where the coastline was being projected further and further north and making a longer and longer journey for the water to get to the sea. And that naturally water began to find its way eastward towards King's Lynn, and undoubtedly there was human intervention. In order to get from Outwell to the Ouse, and also to convert the Ouse from Littleport, instead of going down Old Croft to Wisbeach, to go to King's Lynn. And that would be not all that long after King's Lynn got its first charter from the Bishop of Norwich in 1109, if I remember rightly.
Yes. Now, do you see any comparisons or relationships with the similar landscape of the Isle of Axholme, which was also drained in the 17th century?
Well, I have to confess, I do not know at first hand that terrain. The comment would be that it's a smaller scale, and so far as I recollect, does not have the major rivers like the Ouse and the Nene flowing through it. But that was a major undertaking by Vermuyden for the king.
Were any works performed by other major landowners apart from abbeys? Also, if the area is tidal, did they silt up?
Well, two questions there. We do not know the detail at all. The abbeys owned one side of Southey, Old Southey, in the sense of Cambridgeshire on the south side, bit by Crowland Abbey. Then most of Old Southey was probably a single lordship. And he may well have said to his tenants, "You will go and do some digging, mates." But we do not know.
Now, David Taylor.
Oh, there was a second part to that.
If the area was tidal, did
yes,
the waterways silt up? Or
no, if the waterways silt up, the water's got to go somewhere, and the normal pattern is that sediment is being taken out to sea and brought back again. The coastline is one where it is proceeding northwards at a steady rate as silt is brought down by the rivers and sediment brought in by the sea currents along the coast. If you know North Norfolk coast, there's longshore drift on Scalt Island and Blakeney, westwards into the wash. Material is accumulating from both sources, the river and the sea, and that makes the outfall in any place get more and more difficult. You've got to go do more dredging to get this into the towns, and Spalding has ceased to be a port. It's effectively, it's too far inland.
Yes, no, I know North Norfolk very well and the longshore effect. And now, what is the archaeological evidence for dating? Anglo-Saxon pottery is rare at the best of times. You mentioned the Fenland survey, so I'm...
Yes. Well, there's, if you got, there's been 2 or 3 excavations through banks that are reported in the archaeological work, which were identifying, among other things, sediments and seeing a transition from sediments that were clearly marine sediments to sediments which were clearly freshwater sediments, indicating that the sea was being kept out and therefore indicating that there was a bank. And these sediments contain vegetable and other materials that give you that kind of diagnosis. And there's a very clear view that the tides were not being kept out in the early Anglo-Saxon period, but were by the latter part.
Right, yes. And of course, one of the things that the abbeys were doing were necessarily importing stone to build these new churches and monastic establishments. A lot of stone. So
yes.
One of the purposes of the waterways, presumably, was to actually facilitate the transport of stone, which is
undoubtedly
very difficult to get into the Fens in any other way.
Well, that's undoubtedly the case. And the primary source for that stone was Barnack, between Stamford and Peterborough, but nearer to Stamford than Peterborough. And that stone would have to set off down either the Nene or the Welland. And with the Crowland cut, the Welland became competitive for a good chunk of the Fens compared with the River Nene, if you balance costs of overland cartage from the quarries to the loading site on the river and the distance by water, longer distance round by the Welland, but water costs about 1/10 of land costs.
Well, thank you very much indeed for bringing so many strands together, and the result being this comprehensive set of major engineering works and the social context and economic context which produced them. So many thanks indeed for a fascinating lecture. Now, I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 18th of March, 2021. Sorry, I've had a correction since. That our then proposed speaker will not now be able to attend. We are looking for a replacement to fill the gap, and we'll publicize that on the website in the usual way. But I assure you the gap will be filled, and look forward to our audience, fellows, and many, many others joining us for that. Thank you.